All right, going by the clock on my wall, which says 11:05, which is slightly ahead of the clock on my computer, but I want to go with that one because then we get to start. Again, I'm Tracy Wallace, if you didn't hear me introduce myself, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on new tools from Microsoft for hybrid cloud infrastructure management. This is an early look, and I have to tell you, I went to the Ignite conference at the beginning of November, the Microsoft Ignite conference 2019, and these tools were all over the conference, and I got very excited, and I absolutely, shall we say, soaked in the hype and was very excited to do this when I got back from that conference. And I will tell you that it's an interesting journey, some of these tools, and they're definitely new, and this is definitely an early look. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's go ahead and let's jump in and let's talk about, first of all, hi, I'm Tracy Wallace. I am an Azure Solutions Architect expert, and I would be more than happy for you to reach out, contact me. You can see my contact information here on this slide. And every time that my social media marketing person sees this slide, they're reminded how few Twitter followers I have. So please don't hesitate if you want to follow someone. I'm here for you. All right. Any other way you want to get in touch, that's fine. I have other certifications, but they're really not that important. All right. What are we going to talk about in this webinar? And this webinar should end up being relatively short. I don't think I'll take the entire hour that's blocked out. Of course, if you have questions, one thing I do want to note is if you do have questions, rather than putting them in the chat, if you would put them in the questions and answers section of the interface here, the webinar interface, that way we can make sure as we're going, nothing gets lost, and that I can answer the questions. If there are questions that I can't get to during the webinar, those will be recorded, and I will get those answers out to you. All right, so just something there to think about. All right, so what are the topics that we're talking about? We're going to start out talking about the Microsoft Hybrid Universe, and that is my title, and I don't know, maybe I was thinking a little bit of like comic books or something when I came up with that. Anyways, we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to dive in really into two different tools. The first tool is going to be the Windows Admin Center 1910, which is effectively the fall release of the Windows Admin Center, and why I'm bringing this up in an Azure infrastructure management tool environment. It's got some pretty cool little add-ins to it. And then we're also going to take a look at what Azure Arc is and kind of how you can implement Azure Arc today if that's something that you're interested in doing. And then finally, I'm going to go through some demonstrations of both of these tools. We'll look at coming from the on-prem side with the Admin Center, and we'll look at coming from the Azure side with Azure Arc. And there's a little bit more after that, a little bit of a conclusion, and I do want to just let you know what's coming up as far as some of the learning paths that we're developing here at INE. All right, let's start by taking a look at the Microsoft Hybrid Universe. One of the things that Microsoft has really done pretty much from the beginning with Azure, and in many ways we're out front of some of the other competitors in this way in the cloud space, is really looking at cloud as a hybrid endeavor, right? You've got your on-premises workload, you've got Azure. You know, if you're running Microsoft, they did everything they could to make that as really kind of integrated as possible. And, you know, things such as being able to take a lot of what's on premises and push that into Azure. So whether it is working with log analytics and installing the log analytics agent on machines that are running on-prem, so they're reporting into Azure, and then you can analyze those and even add solutions to that data in Azure. You have things like Azure Backup, Azure Backup Server, which can go and back up elements that are on premises and send those over to Azure, and even things like recovery services, site recovery services, where I'm actually replicating my data not only between on-prem and Azure, but also possibly between two different on-prem data centers. So a lot of things, and I'm not catching all of them, but there are a lot of components that have been added in to really take that experience that is the cloud and integrate it as much as possible into your on-prem environment. And obviously, Microsoft's not the only tool provider to do that. And it's kind of interesting as you go to conferences and you see how they evolve. I don't know that there's a single on-prem vendor that I saw at Ignite that didn't have some kind of hybrid capability, some kind of cloud capability, right? But really what I'm going to focus on are just those capabilities specific to Microsoft that are really baked into the Microsoft products. Now, in terms of hybrid, there are other things that Microsoft has added. You may have heard of Azure Stack. That is something that is actually getting kind of interesting in the different ways that they're implementing it, whether it's Azure Stack Hub or Azure Stack Edge, or what they call what is a hyper-converged infrastructure capabilities. And so they've added that in. But what really hasn't been there has been a management plane that is going to allow me to really manage both sides of the hybrid environment from, and this is a phrase Microsoft loves to use, a single pane of glass, right? So how can I go to one tool and manage these resources that are in multiple places? And again, understanding, I know there's third-party tools out there that do that, but we're really looking at this from the Microsoft standpoint. And in fact, not only looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, how can I manage both on-premises and in Azure, but then how can I really go even farther and incorporate other clouds as well? Now, that's always kind of been there. Just because of the agent-based nature of a lot of what's going on within Azure, not so much giving you a single pane of glass, but all of those things I talked about at first in terms of being able to use backup, being able to write to log analytics. Those are capabilities that really could be implemented across really pretty much any location because you're just really installing agents on machines. But now we're looking at having that single pane of glass. Again, sorry, it's their term, easy term to use. But having that single pane of glass where I can really manage all these things. And that's really what Microsoft is headed for, is to give us that ability to have really a unified experience for managing our resources. Now, in terms of existing hybrid management tools, what are some of the things that we've got in our Azure environment or in our overall environment? When we look at on-premises, I've got a few things in here that you may not necessarily think of. I mentioned some of them. One, System Center Operations Manager, that has the ability to write to the cloud, and quite frankly, I can install agents on my cloud virtual machines and have those report to System Center as well. Mentioned Azure Stack, that's been around for a while in terms of really having a local version of Azure is really what that comes down to. Azure Backup Server, that's going to be software you install on your local network that really acts as a local backup server, but then has that ability to hybridize that into the cloud. And then one that I included on here, and for me, this is an important part of the story, and this is true really for any cloud provider, is I put in SQL Server Management Studio. I almost forgot what the tool I've used for over a decade is called, but SSMS, right? That's just an example of an on-prem tool that works with the cloud, right? Whether I'm going against a VM or even if I'm going against SQL Server that's hosted as a platform service, right? So an Azure SQL database. So there's really a number of tools that are on-prem that can work with the cloud. And likewise, there's a number of Azure tools that are and have been designed to work in this hybrid environment. Log analytics, I mentioned that, the ability to write your performance data and your diagnostic log data into a central location. IoT Edge, pretty interesting stuff, and taking a pre-built box from Azure and putting it in your environment and setting up communication between your environment and Azure for on-prem data collection. Databox is really interesting in terms of getting data over into Azure. There's a number of variations of that, and I even put in there the tried and true import-export jobs. Not really so much hybrid, but really thinking about that interaction between what's on-prem and what's in the cloud. So we have these different existing management tools. There's also third-party tools, right? And that's something, again, we're not really focusing on the third-party tools here, but you're in IT, you're probably using management tools already that are designed for a hybrid environment. And that's honestly, for me, part of the story, an important part of the story right now for some of the tools I'm going to show you. The tools work, but I would definitely say that they're in their early days, particularly the Azure Arc. It's in preview, so that's kind of fair, right? If you're using some of these other tools, then you may actually find that they're right now a little bit forward. Of course, these are also tools that you're getting with Microsoft that by and large you're getting just as part of your normal licensing from Microsoft. Now, what are the tools that, this should not say existing, these are future. The Windows Admin Center 1910, that is a pretty neat tool, and it is a general availability tool. And again, the way that works with Windows Admin Center 1910, 2019, 10th month, really, we're looking at a fall update there. Right, it's part of Microsoft's 6-month update cadence, and so in terms of support and everything else. Now, the big component that we have on Azure is this concept of Azure Arc. And the idea of Azure Arc is simply that you're going to be able to go into Azure, go through the portal, and you're going to be able to manage not only resources that are in Azure, but resources that are really anywhere. Okay? Whether that's on-prem, in another cloud, or in Azure. Okay? And there's really 4 different ones, interestingly enough. The last one is kind of snuck in there. It hasn't really been advertised. It's just, if you look for it, you can find it. The one that's currently in public preview, and it's really going to be the focus of what we're doing today, is the Azure Arc for servers, where we can have some server management through Azure. And then there's also Azure Arc for Kubernetes. That's in private preview, as is Azure Arc for data services. In both cases, what those are, it's really looking at effectively the platform layer and being able to instantiate functionality in your on-prem environment or in your environment somewhere other than Azure that is using Azure functionality. So, for example, data services, there's 2 versions of that. There's the Azure database, Azure SQL database, there we go. And also the Postgres for hyperscale. Both of those now, what you can do is you can say, hey, we have some capacity in our on-prem environment. We want this functionality. We want it on-prem, but we also want Azure to go ahead and manage things like updates and provisioning and all that, and go through the familiar Azure environment. And that's really what both Azure Arc for Kubernetes and Azure Arc for data services do. Again, beyond the scope of what we're going to cover in this webinar. One I'm actually really pretty interested in taking out for a test drive is we now have Azure Arc enabled API management. So if you use the Azure API management service, you can now set up a Azure Arc enabled and Azure Arc managed API management gateway in your on-prem environment. So those are our existing hybrid management, or excuse me, those are the new hybrid management tools. I just made a mistake on the title there. Sorry about that. All right, now what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about Windows Admin Center 1910. All right, if you are not familiar with Windows Admin Center, this is really a tool that Microsoft is putting out that is designed to replace Server Manager. And I gotta say, it's a pretty cool tool. It is web-based, and you'll see a lot of the functionality that you've got in Server Manager, but you're also going to see a lot of commonality, for example, with what you're seeing in the Azure portal. So it's really web-based. It's got a lot of on-prem functionality, right? So performance monitoring, you see that capacity planning, standard system management, things you would expect to have and had in Server Manager, also patch management. So all of these capabilities are actually baked into the Windows Admin Center 1910. It also, as of 1910, has some hybrid capabilities. Now, the first hybrid capability is you have the ability to manage Azure virtual machines, which is really pretty interesting, although I'll make the argument that once you kind of understand how it works, it's not quite as amazing as it would seem, although it does facilitate the process. But also the ability to take a look at using standard Azure functionality. So integrating with Azure Security Center, making it very easy to integrate with Azure Monitor. Now, Azure Monitor, for example, I don't need this to integrate an on-prem workload with Azure Monitor. However, this simplifies the process. And I've gone through the process here. It's easier than what you go through. Not that what you go through with a manual integration is really that challenging, but it absolutely makes it easier to do. And it's the same thing with file synchronization and even business continuity. So doing things like backups, right? All of these operations that are really integrated and hybridized into Azure, right? If you're not an Azure person, then normally what you would have to do is at least become familiar with the Azure portal. Now I can go in as a Windows administrator and say, hey, you know what? I would really like to go ahead and centralize my monitoring with Azure Monitor. It's very cost effective, and go through the process through the Windows Admin Center, which is pretty straightforward. So some pretty cool stuff there. Now, Azure Arc for servers. What is the point of Azure Arc for servers? Azure Arc for servers, here is the idea. The idea is that you are going to register servers across clouds in one place. So I've got my on-prem, I've got my Azure, I've got other clouds, which draw a big nebulous blob, and we'll say that other three-letter cloud, which is awesome. And I've got virtual machines and all of these with different management interfaces, right? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up Arc and register all of these servers. Well, really the one that's in Azure is not registered through Arc, but the others are. And so now I can, for example, go through the portal and I can see this data. Now, right now, while Azure Arc for servers is in preview, I will tell you the primary functionality is metadata. So I can put these in a resource group. I can add tags to these. So if I've got hundreds of servers all over the place across different platforms, and I just want to be able to manage them and see where they are, right? And essentially almost develop a registry for them. Right now, that's the most fully baked feature with Azure Arc for servers. Now, the other thing that you can do right now, and I kind of have sort of here, is you can apply policies. If you are already working with Azure policies and Azure initiatives, then you can apply those policies and initiatives to your external servers, your hybrid servers, the servers that are somewhere other than Azure, right? So if I want to, for example, I don't know, make sure that all my servers are on the same time zone, just one that I actually have applied, then I can go ahead and apply that for my Windows servers. Now, the reason why I say sort of is because the actual policies and initiatives that are currently set up to work with Azure Arc for servers are a little bit limited compared, well, they are limited compared to, say, the entire universe. Also, I have found, quite honestly, that it is pretty difficult to get these to work with off or out of Azure Linux boxes. So I've been able to have some success with the Windows ones, but you can tell this is still being worked on. All right, but that's really right now the primary capabilities that you'll find in the Azure Arc for servers. So we have these two tools. We've got the Windows Admin Center, right? This new web-based tool that's got a lot of functionality just for on-prem, but also now happens to have this added functionality to integrate a couple different ways with Azure. And then we also have this Azure Arc for servers, which is in preview, and I'm going to show you what you can do with it. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start some demonstrations. I'm going to start out with demonstrating Windows Admin Center. Okay, and then I'll also we'll take a look at Azure Arc for servers. And what I want to do is kind of draw out what I've got set up. So I've got three different environments. I've got my on-prem environment, which we'll just say OP, which is my laptop. And in my on-prem environment, I've got a virtual machine. Oops, try and draw that correctly. There we go. I've got a virtual machine which is running Win 2019. So we'll just say Win 19 server. I also have Azure. I'm running Win 19. I'm also running an Ubuntu. We'll just say I think it's Ubuntu 18 on my local machine. I'm very happy they're both running. In Azure, I've got a resource group, which is Arc Demo, and I won't subject you to my writing. I'll actually type that out. And it's not all uppercase. Not sure why I went all uppercase, but it's okay. And I believe I've got a VM in here. I should have a VM, maybe two VMs in here. And I also, for some reason I feel compelled to draw this as a cloud. I have AWS, and I've got a couple EC2 instances running. I've got a Windows 2019, and I've also got an Ubuntu. Now the Ubuntu, I think that's 18. The Ubuntu is important because right now, the only versions of Ubuntu that are the only versions of Linux that are supported for Azure Arc for servers are Ubuntu 16 and Ubuntu 18. And so be aware of that. Now, I've got on my Windows 2019, I've got my Windows Admin Center. Running. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to register a VM from Azure with my Windows 2019. I'll show you what Windows Admin Center 1910. I'll show you what Windows Admin Center is first, and then I'll go and show you how you can add in a machine, an Azure machine. And I'll also tell you what I did behind the scenes to actually facilitate this. All right, then we'll go over to Azure, and I will grab my Ubuntu machine that's on premises. I think I've already got the Windows machine registered, and I'll also register, if we have time, an Ubuntu machine from AWS. But the reality is, registering an Ubuntu machine from on-prem, registering it from AWS, as you will see, is the exact same experience because it is an agent-based experience. You are installing agents on machines, and that's how this whole process works. Okay, so let's get started by taking a look at, gotta find the right machine here. Do I not have it open? Apparently I don't have it open, and that's slightly concerning to me. One moment. It is running. Okay, and connect. Pull this up full size. And while that's waiting, I will go ahead and take a quick sip of water. All right. Again, this is running in a virtual machine on my desktop. My apologies for not having had this already open. All right, there we go. Just fixing the date and time. We'll see why that is momentarily. In that show, full screen this. Okay, here we go. Maybe. There we go. All right, I currently have my Windows Admin Center open. Now, in order to have Windows Admin Center open, I installed it. That's a pretty straightforward process. You download an MSI, you run the MSI, it sets up Windows Admin Server. One thing that is a little bit interesting, if you want to take a look at Windows Admin Server, it's actually under the preview/beta page on Microsoft Downloads, and you'll find it. They'll tell you, though, it's not beta. They just haven't moved it anywhere else yet. I think probably they want you to register, which is why they have it. Now, there's different types of machines. Full install is going to give you what's called a gateway, which is this local machine. That is my incredibly well-named server there. And what I'm going to do is just pop in. So this is just, once this shows up, this is just a local machine. Okay, and saying, okay, you're going to connect. How are you going to connect? I'm going to just connect as me to that local machine. And by the way, again, if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them into the questions screen. And we're almost there. Getting closer. Now, as it's coming in, you can see that we've got things like certificates, right? So if I want to see their certificates, I can view that. Let's not even spend time there. But I've got events, files. I can monitor the firewall. I can, local users and groups, apps, networks, performance monitor. I can open up PowerShell. And again, it's going slightly slow here, but that's more because it's running on a virtual machine on a laptop, notebook, than anything else. But you can see, kind of if you've ever used Server Manager, this is going to look familiar. In fact, it's got a bit more than you would have in the standard Server Manager. And again, this is simply the tool that I have for on-prem, nothing to do with Azure. But if we look up here, I have a number of Azure options. Now, the Azure Hybrid Services is supposed to give you a view of all the Azure Hybrid Services on the VM. It takes forever, so I'm not going to run that. But Azure Backup, which I've already set up. Okay? It's super easy to set up. Again, these are actual legitimate Azure functions. And what this is doing is it's saying, okay, let's take a look at what you've got as far as Azure Backup. I'm not going to go through the other ones, but while we're waiting on this, you can actually integrate with Azure Security Center. You can go in and also integrate with Azure Monitor. It makes it very easy to do so. It's just, kind of a click, point and click through the wizard approach. Here we go. All right. So here's my Azure Backup. And at the moment, it looks a little bit scary because I've got a fail, but that was because this machine was off overnight and it was supposed to run and it didn't. But if you are familiar, I can see here's the jobs. Even if you're not familiar, it's a pretty straightforward, view of what's going on. I have the ability to back up now. I can also go and I can see what my backups are. So I've got a backup of the C drive. I do backup occasionally system state. Okay? And I can view recovery points. And there's a recovery point, and I can recover data. So I can really manage the backup. And again, I don't want to take the time to kind of run through all of these, but you'll notice that as open this up, I encourage you, if you've got Azure, if you've got a Windows, machine that can run in Admin Center, go ahead and play around with it. And it's pretty easy to integrate into Azure. You do need an account that has the appropriate rights within your Azure subscription, obviously, to do things like set up backup, et cetera. But it does make it easy. Having said, I'm not going to do this. I'll pop over here to Azure Monitor, and hopefully that will come up relatively quickly. I did set up Azure Monitor earlier, okay, and couldn't detect Azure Authentication Token, so it's got to renew. All right, but you did see the Azure Backup, so we'll leave it there. All right, so Windows Admin Center, it's going to give you the ability to both have your, on-prem management. It's replacing Server Manager and actually integrating kind of other tools with kind of nice interface, very similar to the interface that you have with the portal. But also, you have the ability to add connections, which is pretty cool. All right, so here are the different types of connections. I can add a Windows Server connection, and add a Windows PC, and add a Windows Server cluster, or I can add an Azure VM. You can also create an Azure VM here, but honestly, wouldn't recommend that. I've done it, it works, but if you're gonna create things in Azure, that's one where maybe you wanna go through Azure to do it. Particularly, I'm always gonna use a template to create my resources for production. Now, I'm gonna add an Azure VM, it's gonna ask me to sign in, and so I'm going to do that. Okay. Now, I've already signed in before. This comes up right away because I've done this. First time, you're going to be asked to add your credentials for, valid credentials for a subscription that you're connecting to. All right, what I'm going to do is simply go into INE demonstrations. I'm going to go to a resource group I already have, go to a virtual machine, and pick its IP address. And that is all it takes. Now, I could connect to that one, but since it's going slightly slow, I'm going to connect to one I've already connected. This is another virtual machine. You can see it's in Azure VM. Okay? It's really all the same settings, just two different machines that are in the same. Oh, and now it's decided to have a connection error. All right, well, let's see. Might need to refresh the browser. There we go. Okay. I think I'll need to refresh to get the other one, but here we go. That's the server I just added. And look what I have. I've really just about all the same things that I had for my on-prem, including things like connecting up via remote desktop, right? So if I need to actually get to this, I can, right? And I'm not going to wait for that to come up. I just sometimes can't help clicking things, but Azure Backup, Azure File Sync. And so I am managing this the same way I'm managing my on-prem. Now, here's the reality of the situation. The reason why that worked is because I'm using WinRM over HTTPS. Okay, so I've set up in the background, and really the kind of complex part of this, let me go back to the overview. The complex part of this whole process is actually getting WinRM to work between your on-prem environment and your virtual machines. And the reason why I say that, that's kind of the trick, and I mentioned that before, this is really cool, but really that's what's making this work. And you can really connect to any machine that you've got access to via WinRM. And that integration with the Azure environment really just comes down to the fact that I can register that public endpoint. All right, now this guy has decided, he's probably downloading some updates, but this guy has decided that it wants to really slow down. But you did get the visual on that, and that's really what we have as far as managing. This tool, I think, is an important tool, potentially a powerful tool, right? Because you've got a lot of Windows administrators that need to administer servers. You're migrating into a hybrid environment, right? You don't want to have to train them on two different systems, right? Well, now if they know Windows Admin Center and if they know Server Manager, then they kind of know Windows Admin Center. I have this tool that's going to let me work with both. All right, so that is our Windows Admin Center. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about, you find it here, Azure Arc. There we go. All right, now with Azure Arc, what you're going to do is you are going to register servers that are not in Azure. Simple as that. You're going to register them in Azure, and you're going to have some functionality in Azure. Again, I expect that functionality to grow. But how would I go about adding a resource? So I'm going to go create a resource. And I'm going to put in Arc. And then there's Azure Arc for servers. And then I'm going to go and create this. Now, in order to create this, really what this is doing is generating a script. And notice add machines at scale. right? The only difference between these two, this first one's going to generate a script, and then Add Machines at Scale is going to show you how you could take that script and you could automate it. Now, in my case, I'm going to apply the script with an interactive login. You can use a service principal, and that's really the difference. I can set up a service principal that has rights to register machines, that's the only right it should have. And then I can reference the certificate for that machine, service principal, in order to bulk register different VMs, or machines. I'm going to go ahead and generate a script, see what this does. So now it's going to say, okay, where do you want this to go? I want this to go into Arc Demo. There are very limited regions right now while it's in preview. It's only available West US, West Europe, Southeast Asia, right? So not quite every region of the world, but definitely a good number of them. Now, for this one, I'm going to go ahead and register a Windows operating system. And what that's going to do is that is going to give me a script. Now, I can download the script, but if I download the script, it's exactly the same as this script. So what I want to do now is pull up. Actually, I'm going to do it from here. Okay. I'm going to do essentially the same thing here. This is a Windows machine. If you look at that, hopefully you can see it's running on Amazon AWS. And I've logged in to the dashboard. And so what I'm going to do on this machine is go and say Arc again. Azure Arc for servers. Create, generate script. Okay. And Windows operating system, that's what I want. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up. I realize I don't have to do this when I'm on the server, but it's just force of habit. And let's go that one and that one. Now I'm going to do these one at a time. Get this out of the way. That was not at all what I meant to do. That was what I meant to do. That's right. I know how to use these tools. All right, and let's bump the font up a bit here. But that will be reasonably readable. And then I'm really just going to go through, again, one at a time and go through the setup process. So I'm going to take this and copy it and paste it. There we go. So that is downloading the setup. We are just about there. Now, I will tell you, I was going to go ahead and go through and go ahead and register a Linux machine. I will tell you, as long as you've got an Ubuntu machine, the process is really the same. Okay, you're going to connect up, and I was going to bounce back and forth, but that gets confusing. So we'll just stay here waiting for this to download, unless I give up on waiting. I will tell you that on the AWS side, I was running the free tier, and I was just way too slow. So this is at least faster. And well, I may be changing my mind once again. Okay. That's taking a bit longer than I'd hoped. There we go. All I had to do was give up on it. All right, next, I'm going to take the actual installation, which should be faster. And the last step, there we go, is going to be to actually register this. All right, now it's actually pretty cool. I'm going to take this and pop this up. Okay, this uses the old, if you've ever used the device login, which is how you used to have to use the CLI. That really goes back and use that. I can sign in on a browser on any machine. I don't have to be on the same machine, but we'll go ahead and use this machine because it's kind of already logged in. I'm going to go to aka.ms/device login. Put that code in. And then I'm going to sign in, take that account. I've now signed in. And it's going to authenticate. Now, this process does take a couple minutes. I'm not going to wait for this process because I've already got one. There we go. Actually, cool. It might be all right already. All right, but in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to my dashboard and I'm going to go to my resource. This is a resource group where I've installed everything, provisioned everything. And I sort that. And somewhere up here, usually, oh, there we go, right at the top. Okay. Now, I've already got my local machine registered. That is actually my local Windows machine. And I actually already have a Linux box that's in AWS registered. Now, if I go to my local machine, right, the idea is, hey, we've got something very similar to what you have with an Azure VM, except honestly, you don't. There's only a few things you can do right now with Azure Arc for servers. And this is where, for me, it falls down just a little bit. And this is something, again, it's in preview. So hopefully they'll give you more, but this is a taste of what they're going to have. Now, I do have activity log, right? And that's going to show you what's been going on with this machine. And we can see that we've got some actions here, and we'll get to those in just a minute. Now, access control, that sounds really cool. It's really just access control to this registration. That's why, like I said, a lot of this is really just kind of metadata right now. Okay, you do have the ability to tag. So if I wanted to say, you know what, I want all of my machines to be associated with various cost centers, I could absolutely do that. Okay. Now, the only thing that's really particularly active with this, and this is across both Windows machines and Linux, which again, right now is just Ubuntu, but that's going to expand, is the application of policies. All right, and what's actually pretty cool here, hopefully you'll be able to see this. I have a policy that I'm applying at this VM. Now, I could have and should have applied this at the resource group level. Would have worked fine. Okay? And this policy is to audit Windows VMs that are not set to a specified time zone. Okay? And so I set up this policy to look for machines that are not set to East US. All right, so whatever, Eastern time zone. And I've got deploy prerequisites. Now, this was pretty cool. What it did is it went out, and this is actually an initiative. It's got two different parts. One, it's going to deploy any prerequisites. So it's going to deploy any agent it needs in order to view the specified time. And it did that successfully. Okay? And I can actually go events, no events, okay? And there's the remediation task. Okay? So that actually happened, I believe, last night. Awesome. Okay, and that's cool. Now, if I go back and show audit results, now this says it's compliant, but it says it's compliant because I fixed it. If I go to events, oh, now it's not going to show me that. All right. Well, now it's in compliance. But earlier, it was not in compliance. Sorry, kind of wasted that. Oh, well, let's go events. Nope, that's just that. All right. Well, unfortunately, I already fixed this. But you're going to have to take my word on it that about 10 minutes before this webinar, it was not in compliance. And so I went in and I actually set my local machine, the virtual machine, to have the East US time zone. All right. And so you can apply policies. If you're already applying policies as part of your Azure environment, then this is something that can be really useful. If you're not already applying policies, then it may not be something that you want to do. In fact, let's go ahead and take a quick look at some conclusions here that I've drawn. So what would I say as far as recommendations? Windows Admin Center, honestly, I would suggest that you take a look at using this completely separate from thinking about the hybrid environment. But it's also an easy way for Windows admins to integrate some of that hybrid functionality, really that hybrid functionality that already existed, but making it easier for, say, non-Azure admins to integrate that into their overall workflow. Also, if you're already using WinRM, or if you're willing to use WinRM, then it's pretty useful, right? As you saw, I connected up to a virtual machine running in Azure, and I was able to really interact with it the same way I would interact with a machine that's sitting on premises. So I feel that that is definitely something worth taking a look into. In fact, of the two, I will tell you, of the two different systems that I've gone over today, it was the one I initially wasn't amazed by, but I think it's the stronger of the two right now. But again, that's because Azure Arc for servers is not fully baked. It's in preview, and you can tell that. I would say don't look at this as something you can go and absolutely immediately deploy policies, particularly if you haven't worked with policies, because they can be a little bit tricky. If you are already working with Azure policies and you're really using that to manage the configuration of your Azure resources, then I would absolutely say you probably want to go ahead and maybe take a look, do a little bit of proof of concept. I would also say absolutely keep an eye on this. I fully expect the Azure Arc in general and the Azure Arc for servers specifically to really start to grow and evolve, or to continue to grow and evolve, because they really don't have an option, right? AWS has their hybrid management system, their third-party hybrid management systems out here. This is something that's kind of been a little bit missing from the portfolio, and it's something that I think, there's absolutely, since it's agent-based, there's a lot that they can do with this, and there's a lot I expect them to do with this. All right, that's it for the content of this webinar. I do want to take just a moment. In addition to presenting this webinar, I'm also the content director for Microsoft Content, and that's something, if you're not familiar with INE, we've been really a Cisco training shop for over 16 years now, and they brought me in to really start building out the Microsoft Content, and that's really what we've started to do. And the way we've really defined the Microsoft Content is by learning path. So we're building learning paths, and those learning paths are being built to really align with certifications right now. Now, we're going to end up building those out. So we have more deep dives that go into very specific topics. Right now, we've got the Azure Architect is available if you're interested in that certification. We do have a full learning path with over 55 hours of content. The Azure Administrator is very close, and we're very close to end of Q4. All of the content videos are done for that. We're just putting the bows, if you will, on the last couple of courses for that. And then you see other things that are coming out for Azure, Azure Developer, Azure DevOps, not on this list, but probably going to get added in. It's actually Azure Fundamentals. So if you're not familiar with Azure at all, we should have a learning path up there for you. And let's see, anything else? Microsoft 365, if you're interested in that, we've got some authors working on, some content creators working on some courses for that, all on demand. Teamwork and messaging should come out in Q1, and our modern desktop should come out in Q2 of 2020. And we're also looking to build out Teams Administrator and eventually Enterprise Administrator as well. Hopefully these timelines will come up a little bit. And if you're on-prem right now, we do have someone working on Windows Server MCSE, but that isn't due to be finalized until Q3. All right, that is it for this webinar. I actually did finish a couple of minutes early, which is, I said this was going to be a short one. Well, it's 7 minutes short. I do not see any open questions, so I'm assuming we're all good. I do want to thank you for being part of this webinar, for coming to, again, this intimate presentation of a webinar. And, oh, there we go. Hey, thank you, Steve.